The holiday season was supposed to be magical, but for me, it had begun to feel unsettling. I had always trusted my husband Ethan implicitly. We'd built a life together, steady, predictable, and comforting in its routine. But as December rolled around, something began to shift. Ethan, usually so present and warm, started to withdraw. At first, it was subtle. Missed texts, a distracted look during dinner. Then it became more pronounced. He stayed longer at the office and carried his phone everywhere, typing furtively with the screen tilted away from me. My unease grew in tandem with his absences. I tried to brush it off as holiday stress. Work always ramped up for Ethan toward the year's end. But this year, there was a new edge to his behavior. He laughed less, avoided eye contact, and seemed to guard his phone like it contained state secrets. Then there was the matter of his late-night texts. Once, I caught a glimpse of his screen, only to see the message thread quickly swiped away. "It's just work stuff," he'd say if I asked. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. One evening, over dinner, Ethan mentioned an upcoming office holiday party. The announcement felt casual, as though he was trying to downplay it. He shrugged off my offer to join him, insisting it was a boring event and not worth my time. Normally, I might have let it go, but something about his tone stuck with me. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he avoided my gaze, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth. My gut told me there was more to the story. On the night of the party, Ethan left the house dressed sharply, his cologne lingering in the air long after he walked out the door. I watched him go, a knot tightening in my stomach. I spent the evening pacing the living room, trying to focus on a holiday movie, but my mind kept drifting back to Ethan. What if my suspicions were wrong? I hated the thought of doubting him. Yet, the unease gnawed at me. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Ethan returned home. The sound of the door opening jolted me awake. I rushed to meet him in the foyer, only to find him disheveled and oddly evasive. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, and he smelled faintly of alcohol and something sweeter, something floral. When I asked how the party went, his response was clipped, almost rehearsed. He claimed it had been a dull affair, full of forced cheer and office small talk. He didn't elaborate, brushing past me with a weary smile as he headed for the bedroom. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. The next morning, while Ethan showered, I decided to put my unease to rest. It felt wrong, invading his privacy, but I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in my head. I checked the pocket of his jacket, which was still draped over the chair in our bedroom. What I found stopped me cold. In the pocket was a crumpled receipt from a nightclub, one I'd never heard him mention. The timestamp showed it was from the previous night, long after he'd said the party had ended. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. Before I could fully process it, my fingers brushed against something else. Digging deeper into the pocket, I pulled out a delicate piece of lace, a woman's underwear. My heart hammered in my chest. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The lipstick marks on his shirt I'd noticed earlier that morning suddenly felt like a glaring clue rather than an accident. It was too much to dismiss as coincidence. Ethan emerged from the bathroom, toweling his hair, his demeanor casual and unbothered. I stuffed the evidence back into the pocket, my heart pounding. I forced a smile, but my mind was already racing with questions. Who had he been with? What was he hiding? And more importantly, how was I going to uncover the truth without tipping him off? As the day wore on, my resolve hardened. I needed answers, and I was determined to get them. The holidays were no longer a season of joy and celebration. For me, they had become a puzzle, one I was intent on solving, no matter the cost. The receipt from the nightclub lingered in my mind like a splinter I couldn't dislodge. I had to know what had happened there. Using the guise of helping a friend scout venues for an event, I decided to pay the place a visit. It was a bold move, and I knew it, but desperation made me braver than I'd ever imagined. The club was dimly lit even in the afternoon, its interior a stark contrast to the cheery holiday decorations outside. Music thumped softly in the background as staff prepared for the evening crowd. I approached the bar, ordering a drink to steady my nerves. It felt surreal being there, imagining Ethan in the same space, possibly with someone else. My stomach churned at the thought. After a few minutes of casual observation, I spotted the security cameras perched discreetly in the corners. My heart raced. If there was any proof of Ethan's activities, those cameras might hold it. Feigning curiosity, I struck up a conversation with the bartender, asking about the venue's amenities and subtly steering the discussion toward their security policies. He mentioned that footage was kept for a week before being overwritten, which meant I didn't have much time. As I wandered the venue, taking mental notes and playing the part of an event planner, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see Ryan, an old acquaintance from college, now wearing the confident demeanor of a manager. We hadn't seen each other in years, but he greeted me warmly, clearly intrigued by my unexpected presence. Over coffee in a nearby cafe, I decided to share my dilemma. It felt risky, but I needed help, and Ryan's position at the club made him the perfect ally. I described Ethan's recent behavior, the nightclub receipt, and my suspicions. I left out the underwear. Some details were too raw to share. Ryan listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as I spoke. At first, Ryan hesitated to get involved. He explained the potential risks of accessing security footage without proper authorization. But he also knew me well enough to sense my desperation. I promised him a favor in return, though I wasn't entirely sure what I could offer. After a long pause, he agreed to help, but only if I kept things discreet. Relief washed over me as I realized I might finally get some answers. Ryan explained that he needed a day or two to review the footage. He'd look for anything unusual from the night in question and let me know what he found. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, it felt like I was moving toward the truth instead of spinning in circles. That evening, I tried to act normal around Ethan, though it was a struggle. My mind raced with possibilities. What would the footage show? Would it confirm my worst fears or reveal something entirely unexpected? Every glance Ethan threw my way felt loaded, as if he knew I was onto him. I reminded myself to stay calm. If he suspected anything, my plans could fall apart. The next day passed in a haze of anticipation. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, hoping it was Ryan with an update. By the time his call finally came, my nerves were frayed. He'd found something, but he wanted to meet in person to discuss it. The tone of his voice told me it wasn't good news. When I arrived at the cafe, Ryan's expression confirmed my fears. He slid a USB drive across the table, explaining that it contained clips from the security cameras. What he'd seen was enough to warrant a private meeting. I thanked him, my hands trembling as I pocketed the drive. My curiosity burned, but I couldn't bring myself to watch it there. I needed the privacy of home and the strength to face whatever it revealed. The drive home felt endless. My thoughts spiraled as I imagined every possible scenario. By the time I reached the house, my resolve was wavering, but I forced myself to sit down with my laptop. As the video loaded, my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the ambient noises of the house. The footage began, and I steeled myself for what was to come. When the video began to play, I sat frozen, bracing myself for what I might see. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual, just partygoers laughing, chatting, and enjoying the holiday atmosphere. The camera's angle offered a broad view of the club's main floor, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe this would all turn out to be a misunderstanding. But then I spotted Ethan. He appeared on the screen, dressed in the same sharp suit he'd worn to the party. My stomach clenched as I watched him weave through the crowd with a drink in hand. He didn't look like the distant, distracted man I'd come to know in recent weeks. Instead, he seemed relaxed, even animated. My relief vanished, replaced by a sinking feeling. The footage soon revealed why. A woman entered the frame, and Ethan's entire demeanor changed. She was striking, with blonde hair and a confident smile. I recognized her immediately. Emily, one of his colleagues. They'd worked together for years, and I'd always thought of her as a harmless acquaintance. But as I watched them interact, it became clear there was nothing harmless about their relationship. They moved closer, their body language intimate in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Ethan's hand rested on her lower back as they danced, their faces inches apart. My pulse quickened, each second of footage feeling like a fresh wound. The camera's angle shifted as they moved to a secluded corner of the club. They disappeared from view, leaving me staring at an empty frame and imagining the worst. When they reappeared several minutes later, my worst fears were confirmed. Their clothes were slightly rumpled, and Emily's lipstick was smudged. They were laughing, their heads close together as if sharing a private joke. The sight of Ethan smiling so freely, so intimately, with someone else felt like a knife to my chest. I paused the video, unable to watch any further. My hands shook as I closed the laptop, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. But as much as I wanted to confront Ethan right then and there, I knew I needed more than just this footage. If I was going to confront him, I wanted to have undeniable proof, something he couldn't dismiss or explain away. That night, as Ethan slept soundly beside me, I made my move. His phone was charging on the nightstand, and I'd memorized his passcode months ago, back when trust hadn't been an issue. My heart pounded as I unlocked the screen, half hoping I wouldn't find anything incriminating. But my hope was short-lived. The messages were there, glaringly obvious in their impropriety. His conversation with Emily was pinned at the top of his messaging app, their exchanges filled with suggestive language and inside jokes. Scrolling further, I found photos, selfies of Emily in outfits I'd never seen her wear in public, pictures of Ethan grinning in settings that weren't our home or office. There were also plans for future meetups, thinly veiled under the guise of work obligations. Each discovery felt like a slap to the face. My hands trembled as I took screenshots, saving them to a folder on my own phone. I hated myself for snooping, but I hated Ethan more for giving me a reason to. By the time I finished, I felt numb. The weight of what I'd uncovered too much to process all at once. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling as Ethan slept peacefully beside me. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Why had he done this? And most importantly, what was I going to do next? Confronting him felt inevitable, but I knew I needed to be smart about it. This wasn't just about our relationship. It was about my dignity, my future, and the choices I'd have to make in the aftermath of his betrayal. By morning, I had resolved to confront him soon, but not yet. First, I needed to figure out what my next steps would be. The truth was out, but the battle had only just begun. The weight of betrayal had settled over me, but I wasn't about to let it crush me. If Ethan thought he could get away with this, he had underestimated me. I needed to think strategically, to plan my steps carefully. Confronting him directly wasn't enough. I wanted to ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions, not just for me, but for everyone he had deceived. The first thing I did was contact a divorce lawyer. I had no intention of making any rash decisions, but I needed to understand my rights and the options available to me. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I laid everything out: the footage, the messages, and the years we'd spent building a life together. The lawyer listened attentively, offering reassurance and advice. Their calm demeanor gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in days. During our discussion, the lawyer suggested I start gathering more evidence, particularly anything that could prove financial misconduct. I hadn't considered that angle, but it made sense. Ethan and I shared joint accounts, and if he'd been using our money to fund his affair, it would strengthen my case. That evening, I pored over our bank statements, my heart sinking with every discovery. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Expensive dinners, jewelry purchases, and even a weekend getaway I hadn't known about. All of it pointed to Ethan's reckless spending on Emily. The realization stung more than I expected. It wasn't just the betrayal of his affair. It was the fact that he'd used our hard-earned money to fuel his lies. I documented everything, creating a detailed timeline that linked his purchases to their messages and photos. Once I had enough evidence, I began planning my next moves. Ethan's company had strict policies against workplace relationships, especially those that involved power imbalances. While he wasn't Emily's direct superior, their relationship still posed a clear violation. I decided to contact his boss anonymously, providing the evidence without revealing my identity. It felt risky, but the thought of him facing professional consequences gave me a sense of justice. My next step was to reach out to Emily's partner. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew they deserved to know the truth just as much as I did. I found their contact information online, crafting a careful message that included screenshots of the messages and photos. I offered support, letting them know they weren't alone in facing this betrayal. When I hit send, a wave of guilt washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of solidarity. We were both victims of Ethan and Emily's selfishness. Throughout all of this, I meticulously documented every step I took. I saved emails, recorded calls, and kept a journal of my actions and findings. It wasn't just about protecting myself legally, it was about reclaiming control over a situation that had left me feeling powerless. Every piece of evidence I collected felt like a small victory, a step closer to ensuring Ethan couldn't manipulate his way out of accountability. As the days passed, I played the part of the unsuspecting wife, biding my time and waiting for the right moment to confront Ethan. He continued his charade, oblivious to the storm I was preparing. Each time he smiled at me or made a casual remark, I felt a mix of anger and determination. The man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I could barely recognize. I knew the confrontation would come soon, but I wasn't in a rush. For now, I focused on building my case and strengthening my resolve. Ethan might have shattered my trust, but he hadn't broken me. And when the time came, I'd make sure he understood exactly what he'd lost. The day of the confrontation arrived sooner than I expected. I'd rehearsed the scenario in my head countless times, but nothing could prepare me for the storm of emotions coursing through me. Every shred of evidence I'd gathered was meticulously organized and laid out, ready to be presented. I waited until Ethan was home, settling into his usual routine, before making my move. When I approached him, he was sitting in the living room, scrolling on his phone as though nothing in the world could disturb him. The sight of his nonchalance ignited a fire within me. I stood before him, holding the folder that contained everything: the bank statements, the messages, the photos, and the footage. Without preamble, I dropped it onto the coffee table in front of him. The sound echoed in the silent room, signaling the start of a confrontation that would change everything. At first, Ethan's reaction was predictable. He feigned confusion, asking what this was all about. His attempts to deflect only fueled my resolve. I explained the contents of the folder, walking him through the timeline of his betrayal. With each piece of evidence I laid bare, his defenses crumbled further. He tried to deny it, of course, claiming the footage was misleading, the messages taken out of context. But the look in his eyes betrayed him. He knew the charade was over. When I pulled out the screenshots of his exchanges with Emily, the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of the proof was too much for even him to spin into a lie. Finally, he admitted to the affair, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a moment of victory, but it brought no satisfaction. The man I'd loved and trusted had shattered everything we'd built, and no amount of apologies could piece it back together. I'd prepared for his pleas, but hearing them still stung. He begged for forgiveness, swearing it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. He promised to end it, to make things right, to do whatever it took to earn back my trust. But his words were empty, hollow echoes of a man scrambling to save himself. I listened, not out of sympathy, but to let him feel the full weight of his desperation. When he finished, I reached into my bag and pulled out the divorce papers. The sight of them silenced him, his pleas dissolving into stunned disbelief. I told him this was the only way forward. There was no salvaging our marriage, not after what he'd done. His betrayal had cut too deep, and I refused to spend another day pretending things could ever go back to the way they were. I made it clear that this wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the manipulation, and the utter disregard for our life together. I explained the consequences he'd face, professionally and personally. His company's strict policies meant he'd likely face disciplinary action, if not termination. And Emily's partner now knew the truth, thanks to me. Ethan's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. It wasn't fear of losing me, it was fear of losing everything. His career, his reputation, his comfortable life. I stood my ground, refusing to let his panic sway me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming my dignity and independence after he'd spent so long undermining it. As I walked away from the confrontation, leaving him alone with his guilt and the evidence of his betrayal, I felt a strange sense of calm. The battle was far from over. There would be legal proceedings, emotional fallout, and the daunting task of rebuilding my life. But for the first time in weeks, I felt in control. Ethan's choices had brought us to this point, and now he would face the consequences, just as I had faced the truth. The day the divorce was finalized felt surreal. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and an undeniable sense of freedom. The chapter with Ethan was closed, sealed with signatures and the weight of truth that could no longer be ignored. It hadn't been an easy road, but it was one I'd walked with purpose. I left the past behind as I stepped into a new phase of my life. Ryan had been a surprising ally through it all. After everything he'd done to help me uncover the truth, I wanted to return the favor. Through some well-connected acquaintances, I managed to help him land a management position at a more prestigious venue. The new role came with a higher salary and an environment that truly appreciated his talents. His gratitude was humbling, but I saw it as a small repayment for the trust and support he'd given me when I needed it most. It was through Ryan's new position that my world began to expand. He introduced me to a social circle I never would have encountered otherwise. These were people who were kind, driven, and refreshingly genuine. Among them was someone who stood out, someone whose presence felt like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. I hadn't expected to feel a spark so soon after the chaos of my divorce, but life, it seemed, had a way of surprising me. Still, I didn't rush into anything. My priority was rebuilding my own life, piece by piece. I threw myself into my career, taking on new challenges and rediscovering passions I'd set aside during my marriage. The work was demanding but fulfilling, and it reminded me of my own capabilities. For so long, I defined myself through the lens of my relationship with Ethan. Now, I was learning who I was without him. The process of healing wasn't linear. There were days when the memories of betrayal crept in, threatening to pull me back into the darkness. But each time, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. I leaned on the friendships I'd built, finding solace in their encouragement and laughter. Slowly but surely, the wounds began to scar over, no longer raw but a reminder of my resilience. The person who had sparked my interest became a quiet but consistent presence in my life. They didn't push or rush me, understanding the complexities of my situation. Instead, they offered companionship and a reminder that not all connections had to be painful or fraught with deception. It was a refreshing contrast to everything I'd endured, and it gave me hope that perhaps, one day, I could trust again. As the months passed, my life transformed in ways I hadn't thought possible. The fear and uncertainty that had once dominated my thoughts were replaced by a sense of empowerment. I was no longer the woman who doubted her worth or her instincts. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. On a quiet evening, as I sat by the window watching the city lights, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. There had been heartbreak and anger, but also growth and unexpected joy. The person I saw in the reflection wasn't defined by the pain of the past, but by the strength it had forged within her. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free, and the future was mine to shape.